That is the honest truth. Nobody in Washington District of Columbia expected it. Nobody in London expected it. Nobody sitting in those tall glass towers in Paris saw it coming. Even within the borders of our own continent, many did not see it arriving, not this fast, and certainly not this clearly. Nigeria, the giant of the West, made a move, and for a moment, the world simply stopped. To understand why this moment is a hinge in history, we must first look at the sheer scale of the nation involved. Nigeria is not a small country. It is not a quiet country. It is not the kind of nation that makes a move and goes unnoticed. It is a land of over 220 million people, a population larger than most countries in Europe and many other regions of the world combined. It is a powerhouse of oil, gas, and a music industry that has the entire globe dancing to its rhythm. It is a technological and cultural giant that everyone knows, even those who refuse to admit it. Every ear turns, every eye shifts, and every calculator in every foreign ministry building begins to run numbers very quickly when Nigeria speaks. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. If you believe in these stories, give us your like, leave your thoughts, and subscribe to continue this journey together. Across the border, in Burkina Faso, a young leader named Ibrahim Traoré has been speaking a language that makes powerful countries deeply uncomfortable. From the moment he came to power, he has moved beyond the empty speeches of diplomatic conferences. He has translated words into actual policy decisions that prioritize the dignity of a country tired of being treated as if it existed only to serve foreign interests. He told Western military forces to leave. He said no to the arrangements that had kept his people dependent and controlled. He began to speak of sovereignty, of fair value for resources, and of a future where Africa negotiates from a position of collective strength instead of individual weakness. The response from the global centers of power was as predictable as it was fast. They called him dangerous. They called him unstable. They applied the quiet pressure that power always uses to silence those who stand too tall. They whispered in ears and made the phone calls that were meant to force him back into his lane and keep him quiet. But Ibrahim Traoré did not sit down. He kept standing. And then the giant looked across the horizon. Nigeria looked at the results being achieved in Ouagadougou. Nigeria looked at its own history, its own staggering oil wealth that somehow never quite became the prosperity its people deserved. It looked at a long legacy of signing agreements that sounded grand at the ceremony, but felt like chains 10 years later. And then Nigeria made a decision. It did not stand with him in a small, quiet, diplomatic way that could be minimized or explained away. It stood next to him in a way that everyone could see. The official statements were carefully worded, as they always are, but the meaning beneath the ink was not careful at all. Nigeria was declaring that the direction pointed out by the administration in Burkina Faso was the right direction. It was a signal that African countries working together, deciding together, and negotiating as a unit was no longer a radical dream. It was the only sensible path forward. It was a recognition that for far too long, the continent had been talked to, but never listened to. To understand why this is a revolution of the heart, we must look at the lives lived next to the oil fields. Imagine a man named Emma, from a state in southern Nigeria, who spent 17 years working on the ground where the oil is pulled from the earth. Not in the fancy offices where the big decisions are made, but in the dirt, doing the actual labor. He watched the tankers fill up and leave. He watched the money flow out of his country in structures that were almost impossible for an ordinary person to track or understand. He watched his community stay poor, while the ground beneath their feet made people in distant lands rich. There are millions of people across this continent like Emma. People who spend their whole lives living next to resources that should make their nation wealthy, yet spend those lives wondering why that wealth never seems to arrive for them. When Nigeria made its move, when it stood beside the vision in the Sahel and said the world's relationship with Africa must change, people like Emma understood it immediately. They did not need an expert to analyze the geopolitical shift. They felt it in their bones. It was the sound of someone finally naming the feeling they had carried for a lifetime. That night, a brother called a brother to say, "Something is changing, I can feel it, I believe him." This is the awakening that Washington and Paris fear most, not the politics of a single leader, but the birth of an idea that cannot be silenced. The reaction from Washington was fast, it was loud, and it was, if you were paying attention, very revealing. The language they used was about stability. It is always about stability. We have been taught for generations that when a poor country does exactly what a rich country tells it to do, that is called stability. When that same country starts making its own decisions, when it starts looking at its own people instead of foreign ministries, that is suddenly called instability. It is one of the most consistent tricks in the foreign policy book, and the world has finally stopped believing in the illusion. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be thank you Traore, or thank you Burkina Faso, or simply thank you for hope. Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this. Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement. So write your thank you now, and let your voice be part of this shared journey. To understand the weight of Nigeria's decision, we must understand the cage. Nigeria, despite its immense talent and oil, owes significant amounts of money to international lenders and institutions whose names sound neutral but whose power sits firmly in the hands of a small number of wealthy countries. This debt is the cage. It shapes what a nation can and cannot do. It makes certain relationships harder to maintain and certain choices met with quiet, devastating consequences. Most African countries exist inside this cage, spending their energy defending old arrangements to the people who benefit from them. But Ibrahim Traoré has been saying something that Nigeria has now amplified to the entire world. You cannot get out of a cage you refuse to admit you are in. You cannot negotiate better terms if you pretend the current ones are fine. Nigeria looked at its own situation, its debt, its oil wealth that never quite became prosperity, and its 17 years of watching people like Emma labor while the value left the soil. Nigeria decided to name the cage. They decided to describe it clearly and start building the door. This is what caused the genuine surprise in the briefings in Washington. Underneath that surprise was something that looked a lot like fear. Not fear of a military threat, but fear of an idea. The fear of what happens if this idea spreads across the borders of Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania, and Kenya. The global strategy has always been to never deal with Africa as a whole. You deal with this country separately and that country separately. You give one leader a slightly better deal so he has an incentive not to cooperate with his neighbor. You create just enough division and just enough competition that collective action becomes impossible. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply how power works when it is trying to protect arrangements that benefit it. You do not need to sit in a room and plan it. The incentives push you there naturally. But now, Nigeria and Burkina Faso are saying, we see the structure, we understand the game, and we are choosing not to play it anymore. They are choosing to negotiate as a unit instead of 54 separate voices that can be spoken to one by one, divided, and played against each other. The powerful countries talked about links to Russia as if that were the real issue, as if a country choosing its own partners is only a problem when Africa does it. Every major power plays the game of geopolitics. The question is whether you are allowed to play it or whether you are supposed to stay in the lane someone else assigned you. When the mask comes off, you see that the concern for democracy is often just a concern for the status quo. The decision Nigeria made is a step toward changing these arrangements. It is a signal to the woman in the Lagos market, whose prices are shaped by a currency she does not control. It is a signal to the farmer in Kano, whose crop prices are set in markets where he has no seat. And it is a signal to the young person in Abuja who is brilliant but sees the wealth of his nation sent outside before it can build a future for him at home. The strategy that has governed the relationship between the West and this continent for over a century is not a complex conspiracy hidden in shadows. It is a simple, effective piece of arithmetic. You never deal with Africa as a whole. You deal with this country separately and that country separately. You speak to one leader in a private room and offer him a slightly better arrangement, a slightly lower interest rate, or a slightly more prestigious title, provided he does not cooperate with his neighbor. You create just enough competition, just enough friction between brothers, that collective action becomes a logistical impossibility. This is how power protects itself, by ensuring the many never realize they are stronger than the one. But when Nigeria stood beside Burkina Faso, that arithmetic began to fail. The surprise in Washington District of Columbia was not about the individual politics of Ibrahim Traoré or the specific debt of Nigeria. It was a genuine, visceral fear of the idea itself. It was the fear of an Africa that decides to negotiate as a single, unbreakable unit instead of 54 separate voices that can be pressured, played, and silenced one by one. If this idea spreads, if it moves from the Sahel to the coast, from the west to the east, the old arrangements that have kept the world's warehouse open for business will finally be dismantled. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member, not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for Sankara's Echo's mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The powerful countries reacted by pointing to links with Russia, attempting to frame a nation's choice of partners as a moral failing. They used the same language they have used since the 1960s to suggest that African leaders are incapable of making their own geopolitical moves without being pawns of another power. But every major power on this earth plays the game of geopolitics. They have relationships with whoever serves their interests, regardless of their records or their systems. The question being asked in Ouagadougou and Abuja today is simple. Are we allowed to play the same game, or are we supposed to stay in the narrow lane someone else assigned to us? To move beyond that assigned lane, the continent needs more than just bold statements. It needs the physical and economic infrastructure of independence. For too long, our trade agreements have been ink on paper that never turned into asphalt on the ground. We need real roads, real rail lines, and real payment systems that do not have to route through London or New York just to send money across a border. The African Continental Free Trade Area exists as a document, but building the reality of that document is the true revolutionary work. It is the slow, difficult task of regional integration that requires leaders to choose the harder right over the easier, comfortable relationship with powerful outsiders. Consider the tragedy of our resources, the cotton that becomes cloth in distant factories, the cocoa that becomes chocolate in European kitchens, the oil that returns as refined fuel at prices we cannot afford. In every single case, the most valuable part of the product, the part that creates the jobs and the wealth, happens outside our soil. This is not because we lack the knowledge or the people. It is because the frameworks of the global economy were designed to keep us as the source of the raw and the buyer of the processed. Nigeria choosing to stand with the direction of the Sahel is a vote to change that equation. It is a vote for an Africa that adds value to its own harvest before it ever leaves the coast. The true weight of this moment does not rest in the marble halls of foreign ministries. It rests in the calloused hands of the farmer in Kano and the woman in the Lagos market. These are the lives that have been shaped by arrangements they never signed and systems they never chose. For too long, the elite of this continent have been more comfortable in the clinics of Europe than in the hospitals of their own villages. They have been more interested in the approval of Washington or Paris than in the prosperity of the families who live next to the oil fields. This is the betrayal that has kept the cage locked for generations, a psychological distance between the leader and the led that allows the wealth of the soil to leave while the people remain in the shadows. Nigeria's decision to stand with the direction of the Sahel is a declaration that the era of being a warehouse for the world is coming to an end. It is a refusal to be the place where things are merely pulled out of the ground to be made valuable somewhere else. We have the people, we have the knowledge, we have the intelligence. What we have lacked is the collective political will to build our own processing industries, our own rail lines, and our own payment systems that do not require permission from a foreign capital. The friction we see today, the noise from the West, and the surprise in the briefings of Donald Trump are not signs of failure. They are the evidence that the door is finally being pushed open. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this. Sankara's echo sends you not just thanks, but a blessing for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. The price of this independence is high. It means facing sanctions that tighten the belt of the nation. It means being labeled as dangerous or unstable by the very people who profit from our quietness. It means a manufacturing of dissent and a relentless campaign of media pressure. But the cost of waiting is even higher. The cost of waiting is another year of debt repayments instead of school buildings. It is another year of raw materials crossing the ocean to become expensive products we cannot afford. It is another year of brilliant young people wondering if they must leave their home just to find a future. Ibrahim Traoré has named this cost, and Nigeria has confirmed that the price of freedom is worth paying. We are watching a generation grow up with access to the truth and a connection to each other that ignores the old colonial borders. They are not waiting for a newspaper to tell them what to think. They are making their own analysis. They are seeing that the battery revolution, the clean energy transition, and the technology of the next century all require the very things that sit beneath African soil. The arithmetic is moving in our direction. Our population is growing, our workforce is increasing, and our resources are becoming the engine of the global future. The only question that remains is whether we will own that engine or merely provide the fuel for someone else to drive. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your heart. Every story of dignity, every voice of sovereignty is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe. Let this channel be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is not for us alone, it is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us and be ready for the next chapter that is already waiting to be written. The choice has been made. The old story of Africa as a charity case is being replaced by a new narrative of collective strength. Through the unapologetic vision of Ibrahim Traoré, we are witnessing the birth of a continent that no longer waits for permission to be great. The alliance between the giant of Nigeria and the resilience of Burkina Faso is the first crack in a structure that was once thought to be unbreakable. As the world adjusts to this new reality, let it be known that Ibrahim Traoré is not standing alone, but is leading a chorus of millions who have finally decided to walk through the door together.